A black boy knocks on the door, simply asking for candy, but his neighbor meets him with disdain and chases him away. It could have gone unnoticed, but her act soon turns into a real scandal. Want to know how one innocent visit for candy led to unexpected consequences? Subscribe and watch the rest of the video. The autumn breeze rustled through the brightly colored trees, sending cascades of golden and crimson leaves swirling onto the quiet streets of the new neighborhood. Jaden stood on the doorstep of his new house, gazing out at his surroundings with a sense of both excitement and unease. To him, this move was supposed to mean a fresh start, a chance to belong somewhere, to make friends, and to feel a part of something bigger than himself. His parents had dreamed of this day, and he was determined to make the best of it, even if he couldn't quite shake the anxiety clinging to him like the falling leaves clung to the damp ground. Jaden's family had just moved into this upscale, predominantly white neighborhood, a decision his parents had made after years of saving and dreaming of a better future. They had talked about it often, whispering late into the night about opportunities, about safety, about schools. His mother, a dedicated nurse, and his father, a software engineer, believed this move would provide Jaden with the chance to go to a better school, to have access to more resources, and to thrive. They were determined to create a better life for him, and he felt a duty to make it worth their efforts. As Jaden looked around, he saw his parents bustling around the house, organizing boxes, arranging furniture, and occasionally glancing at each other with tired but proud smiles. The last few weeks had been exhausting, with endless packing and unpacking, but the sight of his parents' happy faces made Jaden feel reassured. He tried to imagine this place becoming their new home, a place filled with laughter, memories, and the warmth they had carried with them from their old neighborhood. His mother noticed him standing on the doorstep and came over, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "What do you think, Jaden? Pretty nice, huh?" she asked, her eyes sparkling with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. Jaden nodded, looking up at her with a small smile. "Yeah, it's different. Bigger than our old place, for sure." His mom chuckled, giving his shoulder a gentle squeeze. "It is, isn't it? We've worked so hard for this. I know it might feel strange at first, but give it time. You'll make friends, and soon it'll feel just like home. Promise." Jaden nodded, but inside he couldn't help feeling a bit uneasy. The neighborhood seemed quiet, almost too quiet. The few neighbors they had met had been polite but distant, their smiles barely reaching their eyes. It was as if they were watching Jaden and his family from a distance, evaluating them in a way that made him feel like an outsider. He brushed the feeling off, telling himself it was just his imagination, a side effect of moving to a new place where everything felt unfamiliar. Days turned into weeks, and Jaden found himself slowly settling into his new routine. He began attending the local school, where he noticed that most of the students were friendly but hesitant to get too close. Occasionally, he would catch them whispering or exchanging glances when he walked by. Still, he did his best to ignore it, focusing on his studies and on being the best version of himself. One sunny afternoon, Jaden's luck changed when he met two kids around his age playing basketball at the park near his house. Their names were Emily and Zach, and they lived in the same neighborhood. Zach was a tall, athletic boy with a quick smile and an easygoing manner, while Emily was shorter and had a mischievous twinkle in her eye. They quickly hit it off, bonding over a shared love for sports, video games, and, to Jaden's relief, Halloween. The mention of Halloween brought a spark to Jaden's eyes. Back in his old neighborhood, Halloween had been a huge event, with everyone decorating their houses, kids running from door to door, and neighbors welcoming them with bowls full of candy. He hoped it would be the same here, though he hadn't seen any decorations go up yet. As the days passed, Jaden spent more time with Emily and Zach, and the three of them became close friends. They would meet after school to play basketball or to explore the neighborhood, talking excitedly about their Halloween plans. Zach was planning to dress up as a superhero, and Emily had decided on a witch costume, complete with a pointed hat and a broomstick. Jaden, on the other hand, was still undecided. He wanted something unique, something that would make him stand out without making him feel self-conscious. One evening, he sat down with his mother to brainstorm costume ideas. "How about a vampire?" she suggested, her eyes lighting up. "You'd look so cool with a cape and fangs." Jaden laughed, picturing himself as a vampire. "A vampire, huh? That could be pretty cool." His mom's face softened as she watched him, sensing his excitement. "You know, Halloween is the perfect time to be whoever you want to be, even if it's just for one night." Jaden nodded thoughtfully, the idea growing on him. He could already imagine himself in a dark cape, his face painted pale, with fangs gleaming under the streetlights. It would be perfect, and for a brief moment he allowed himself to believe that this Halloween would be just like the ones he remembered. The night before Halloween, Jaden and his mom finished putting together his costume. She helped him adjust the cape, carefully painted his face, and handed him a set of plastic fangs. Jaden looked at himself in the mirror, admiring his transformation. For the first time since the move, he felt a surge of confidence, a sense of belonging. "This is going to be the best Halloween ever," he whispered to himself, smiling at his reflection. The next day, Jaden, Emily, and Zach met up in their costumes, ready to hit the neighborhood for a night of trick-or-treating. The streets were filled with children in costumes, their laughter echoing through the air as they ran from house to house, clutching bags that grew heavier with each stop. Jack-o'-lanterns grinned from porches, and decorations hung from trees and windows, casting eerie shadows in the dim light. Jaden felt a rush of excitement as they approached the first house. He could almost taste the candy, feel the thrill of collecting treats with his new friends. The door swung open, and an older woman greeted them with a smile, dropping candies into their bags with a friendly nod. Jaden beamed, grateful for the warm welcome, and felt his confidence grow with each house they visited. But as they ventured deeper into the neighborhood, Jaden began to notice something strange. Some neighbors looked at him with hesitation, their smiles faltering, their hands hovering over the candy bowl as if they were unsure whether to give him any. It was subtle at first, a pause here, a hesitant glance there, but it was enough to make Jaden feel uncomfortable. He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just his imagination. But the further they went, the more noticeable it became. At one house, an elderly man opened the door, his expression turning stony as he looked at Jaden. Without a word, he closed the door, leaving the kids standing in awkward silence. Jaden glanced at Emily and Zach, who seemed just as confused as he was. Maybe he just ran out of candy, he said, forcing a laugh to lighten the mood. Emily and Zach nodded, but Jaden could see the uncertainty in their eyes. They continued on, hoping that it was just an isolated incident. But, house after house, the pattern repeated. Neighbors would open their doors, glance at Jaden, and either refuse to give him candy or simply close the door altogether. By the time they reached the end of the street, Jaden's excitement had faded, replaced by a deep sense of unease. His friends tried to reassure him, suggesting that maybe people were just having a bad night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For the first time, he felt like an outsider in a place that was supposed to be his home. The night ended on a bittersweet note as Jaden returned home with his half-empty bag of candy. His parents could see the disappointment on his face, but he shrugged it off, telling them he was just tired. He didn't want them to worry, didn't want them to feel like their dreams of a better life were being shattered. As he lay in bed that night, Jaden stared at the ceiling, replaying the events of the evening in his mind. He thought about the hesitant glances, the closed doors, the neighbors who had looked at him as if he didn't belong. The excitement he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow ache in his chest. The Halloween he had dreamed of had turned into something else entirely, and he couldn't help but wonder if he would ever truly feel at home in this new neighborhood. Halloween night had come and gone, but the strange, uneasy feeling from that evening still lingered in Jaden's mind. He couldn't shake the memory of the hesitant looks and closed doors, the unspoken message behind every turned back. His friends, Emily and Zach, had reassured him, saying people were just acting strange, maybe tired or busy. They had shrugged it off, laughed even, brushing it aside as if it meant nothing. But Jaden knew better. He felt it deep within him, a faint unease settling like a stone in his chest. Despite his best efforts to ignore it, Jaden noticed that even during the days following Halloween, some students had started looking at him differently. He wasn't sure what had changed, but the shifts were subtle, like invisible walls creeping up between him and the other kids. Conversations would stop when he entered a room, and once friendly classmates seemed distant, their smiles just a little more strained. He couldn't tell if he was overthinking it, but the strange occurrences haunted him in a way he couldn't shake. One afternoon, a few days later, Jaden decided to talk to Emily and Zach about Halloween. They were playing basketball at the park, and he dribbled the ball in silence for a while, watching the two of them as they laughed and joked, unaffected by the unease that had taken hold of him. Finally, he took a deep breath and decided to bring it up. "Did you guys, I don't know," Jaden began, dribbling the ball thoughtfully. "Did you guys notice anything weird on Halloween?" Emily and Zach exchanged a quick glance before Emily shrugged, her expression one of mild confusion. "Weird? Like what?" Jaden stopped dribbling and leaned against the fence, choosing his words carefully. He didn't want to come across as paranoid, but he needed to know if they had felt it too. "I mean, like the way some of the neighbors looked at us, or at me, I guess." Zach paused, looking down at his feet as he kicked a pebble on the ground. "I don't know, man. People are weird sometimes. Maybe they were just tired or didn't feel like giving out candy." Jaden could hear the discomfort in Zach's voice, the reluctance to dig any deeper. "But it wasn't just one person," Jaden pressed, feeling a mix of frustration and desperation. "A lot of them. They didn't seem happy to see me." Emily sighed, shifting from one foot to the other. "Jaden, maybe you're just overthinking it. It's a new neighborhood, and people here, they're just different. But you're here now, and we're here with you. It'll get better." But would it really? Jaden wanted to believe them, wanted to brush it off as they had, but something about their responses didn't sit right with him. It was as if they were trying to protect him by ignoring the truth, hoping that if they didn't acknowledge it, it would go away. Jaden wasn't sure if that was possible, but he forced himself to smile, nodding in agreement, even if a part of him still doubted. As the days wore on, Jaden tried to follow Emily and Zach's advice. He threw himself into his schoolwork, basketball, and video games, keeping himself busy to avoid dwelling on that night. The neighborhood had returned to its quiet, orderly routine, and Jaden found himself hoping that maybe things really would get better with time. On the afternoon of the first Saturday in November, Jaden, Emily, and Zach decided to go trick-or-treating at a few houses they hadn't visited on Halloween. It felt strange to be going after Halloween had passed, but Zach had heard that some neighbors had extra candy left over and didn't mind giving it out to any kids who came by. Emily, as usual, was enthusiastic, and Jaden was curious, though he could feel his anxiety simmering just below the surface. The first few houses they visited were friendly, and Jaden's spirits lifted as he accepted handfuls of candy from smiling neighbors. It was almost enough to make him forget the discomfort he had felt just days before. For a while, he even managed to laugh and joke with Emily and Zach, feeling like himself again. Maybe he had been wrong. Maybe he had overreacted and things were finally going to be okay. But as they walked down one of the quieter streets, Jaden's heart sank when he saw the house up ahead. It was a large, well-kept home with a neatly trimmed lawn and a stone pathway leading to the front door. He recognized it immediately. It was the house of Mrs. Turner, the elderly woman who had been the first to refuse them candy on Halloween. Jaden hesitated, slowing his steps as he stared at the house. The memory of her icy expression and the way she had looked at him with a mixture of suspicion and disdain flooded back, and he felt his chest tighten. Emily and Zach noticed his hesitation and stopped, looking at him with questioning expressions. "Hey, are you okay?" Emily asked, her brows furrowing with concern. Jaden forced himself to nod, even as he felt the uneasy weight settling over him again. "Yeah, I'm fine. I just wasn't sure if we should go to this house." Zach shrugged, giving Jaden a reassuring pat on the back. "Come on, man. Maybe she was just having a bad night. I mean, she's old, right? Let's give her a chance." Reluctantly, Jaden followed them to the doorstep, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. Zach knocked on the door and they waited in silence, the sound of distant laughter and shuffling leaves filling the air. After a few moments, the door creaked open and Mrs. Turner appeared, peering at them with narrowed eyes. Her gaze landed on Jaden, and her expression instantly hardened. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice laced with irritation. Zach held out his bag, flashing her a friendly smile. "We're just out getting some leftover candy, Mrs. Turner." In case you had any extra." Mrs. Turner's eyes darted from Zach to Emily and finally to Jaden. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she took a step back, crossing her arms over her chest. "I don't have anything for you," she said, her tone icy. "Especially not for him." She gestured dismissively in Jaden's direction, her face twisted with a look of distaste that made his stomach churn. Jaden felt a mix of anger and shame welling up inside him, but before he could say anything, Mrs. Turner raised her hand and gave him a light slap on the shoulder, as if to physically push him away. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried a weight that Jaden felt deep within his chest. It was as if she had put all her disdain, all her unspoken judgments into that one movement. "Go on, get out of here," she snapped, her voice low and venomous, "and don't come back." The slap was not hard, but it was enough to leave Jaden stunned, frozen in place as he processed what had just happened. Emily and Zach stood in shocked silence, their faces pale with disbelief. They had expected Mrs. Turner to be unfriendly, maybe even rude, but this was something else entirely. Jaden's heart pounded in his chest as he looked at Mrs. Turner, struggling to find his voice. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words stuck in his throat, trapped beneath a wave of humiliation and hurt. He had never felt so small, so powerless, and the feeling was almost too much to bear. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his head lowered as he fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. Emily and Zach followed, their expressions a mixture of anger and confusion. They wanted to comfort him, to say something that would make it better, but they didn't know how. There was nothing they could say that would erase the pain he felt. As they walked back home in silence, Jaden's mind raced, replaying the encounter over and over. He couldn't understand why Mrs. Turner had treated him that way, why she had looked at him with such contempt. He had done nothing wrong. He was just a kid, just like any other kid in the neighborhood. But in that moment, he felt like he didn't belong, like he was a stranger in a place that was supposed to be his home. When they reached his house, Jaden turned to Emily and Zach, his voice barely a whisper. "Thanks for coming with me," he said, his tone hollow. "But I think I'm done for tonight." Emily and Zach exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with sympathy and guilt. They could see the hurt in Jaden's eyes, the way his shoulders slumped with a weight they couldn't fully understand. They wanted to say something, to offer words of comfort, but they knew that nothing they said would make the pain go away. "Hey, we're here for you," Emily said softly, reaching out to give his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "If you need anything, just let us know, okay?" Jaden managed a small nod, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, thanks." As he watched his friends walk away, Jaden felt a surge of loneliness wash over him, a sense of isolation that he had never experienced before. He had always thought that moving to this neighborhood would mean new friends, new opportunities, a chance to build a life filled with happiness and acceptance. But now, he wasn't so sure. The events of Halloween and the encounter with Mrs. Turner had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about this place, about the people who lived here, and about himself. That night, as he lay in bed, Jaden stared at the ceiling, replaying the encounter with Mrs. Turner in his mind. He wondered if he had done something to deserve it, if there was something wrong with him that made people treat him this way. The more he thought about it, the more the doubt began to eat away at him, filling him with a hollow ache that wouldn't go away. For the first time since they had moved, Jaden felt like he was trapped in a place where he didn't belong, a place where he would always be seen as an outsider, no matter how hard he tried to fit in. And as he drifted off to sleep, a single question lingered in his mind. A question he couldn't answer, but one that he knew would haunt him for a long time. Why? The days after Mrs. Turner's rejection weighed heavily on Jaden's mind, casting a shadow over his once hopeful outlook on the new neighborhood. He had hoped to find comfort in the familiar routines of school and basketball with his friends, but the memory of her harsh words and the slap on his shoulder lingered, filling him with an unease that was hard to shake. It was as though an invisible line had been drawn, marking him as different, as someone who didn't belong. Jaden tried his best to act like everything was fine, putting on a brave face for his parents and friends, but the hurt was still there, simmering beneath the surface. He found himself noticing things he had brushed off before. The cautious glances from neighbors, the slightly too polite smiles, the way people seemed to hold back as if they were unsure how to approach him. These moments, once small and easy to ignore, now felt glaring, reminding him of how he had felt standing on Mrs. Turner's doorstep, unwelcome and out of place. One evening after school, Jaden was hanging out at the park with Emily and Zach, shooting hoops and trying to distract himself. They hadn't talked about Mrs. Turner since that night, but the memory of it hung between them, an unspoken weight they all felt but didn't know how to address. As they played, Zach suddenly suggested, "Hey, why don't we go back to a few of the houses we missed on Halloween? Maybe we'll get some leftover candy." Jaden paused, the basketball resting in his hands. The thought of going back out into the neighborhood, of risking another encounter like the one with Mrs. Turner, made his stomach tighten. But he didn't want his friends to see how much it still bothered him. Didn't want them to think he was weak. "Sure," he said with a forced smile, trying to keep his voice steady. "Why not?" Emily and Zach seemed relieved, their smiles widening as they eagerly led the way. Jaden followed them, doing his best to push down the lingering unease as they made their way through the quiet streets, the soft rustling of leaves underfoot the only sound in the cool evening air. The first house they stopped at was one they hadn't visited on Halloween. A middle-aged woman answered the door, her expression friendly as she greeted them with a warm smile. For a brief moment, Jaden felt his tension ease, and he managed a genuine smile as she handed them each a piece of candy. It was a small thing, but it reminded him of the Halloween nights he had cherished in his old neighborhood, the sense of warmth and community he had once taken for granted. But as they continued on, moving from house to house, Jaden began to notice a pattern. At one house, the homeowner opened the door, glanced at Jaden, and hesitated, her hand hovering over the candy bowl before she offered a half-hearted smile and placed a single piece of candy in his bag. At another house, an elderly man opened the door, looked him over with a frown, and promptly closed it, muttering something under his breath. Jaden's heart sank as the refusals piled up, each one a painful reminder of the invisible barrier between him and the people around him. He could feel his friends watching him, their expressions a mixture of confusion and discomfort, but he kept his head down, refusing to let them see how much it hurt. After another door was shut in his face, Zach finally broke the silence. "What's their problem?" he muttered, his brow furrowing in frustration. "It's just candy. Why are they being so weird?" Jaden shrugged, forcing a nonchalant expression. "Maybe they're just not in the mood to give out candy anymore." But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He could feel the difference, the unspoken message in every closed door, every hesitant glance. It wasn't about the candy. It was about him, about something he couldn't change no matter how hard he tried. The final straw came when they reached a house with Halloween decorations still on the porch, a carved pumpkin grinning eerily from the steps. Jaden hesitated, glancing at Emily and Zach, who gave him encouraging nods. Taking a deep breath, he stepped forward and knocked on the door, hoping that this time would be different. A woman in her 40s opened the door, her face lighting up as she saw Emily and Zach. "Well, hello there," she exclaimed, her voice warm and welcoming. "Aren't you two adorable?" Emily and Zach grinned, holding out their bags, but as the woman's gaze shifted to Jaden, her smile faded. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and her posture stiffened, as if an invisible wall had gone up between them. "Sorry, but I'm out of candy," she said, her tone suddenly cold. She placed a piece in each of their bags, ignoring Jaden's entirely. Jaden's face flushed with embarrassment and anger as he lowered his hand, his fingers curling around the empty edge of his candy bag. Emily and Zach stood in awkward silence, their faces pale with shock. But the woman didn't seem to notice, or if she did, she didn't care. Jaden's voice came out quieter than he intended, barely more than a whisper. "Thank you," he mumbled, turning away before she could see the hurt in his eyes. As they walked down the path, Zach glanced at him, his expression troubled. That was messed up," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. "I don't get it. Why are they treating you like this?" Jaden forced a shrug, his voice strained as he fought to keep his emotions in check. "Maybe they just don't like new people." Emily frowned, her face etched with guilt and sympathy. "Jaden, this isn't fair. You don't deserve this." He appreciated her words, but they did little to ease the ache in his chest. He felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't experienced before, as if he were an outsider in his own life, constantly judged and found wanting. And the worst part was that he didn't know how to make it stop. When they reached the park, Jaden finally let himself sit down on one of the benches, his shoulders slumping as he stared down at his half-empty bag of candy. The excitement he had felt earlier was gone, replaced by a hollow sense of disappointment. He had tried to be optimistic, to believe that things would get better, but the reality was becoming harder to ignore. Emily and Zach sat beside him, their expressions heavy with concern. Zach was the first to speak, his voice filled with frustration. "I just don't get it. We've lived here our whole lives, and I've never seen people act like this before." Jaden's heart sank at Zach's words, the confirmation of his worst fears. If even his friends, who had known these neighbors their entire lives, couldn't understand what was happening, then how was he supposed to make sense of it? He wanted to tell them about the way people had looked at him since he had moved in, the way their smiles never quite reached their eyes, the subtle shifts in tone whenever he was around. But he was afraid of what they might say, of the possibility that they wouldn't believe him, or worse, that they would see him differently. After a long silence, Jaden spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Maybe they just don't like me." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with sadness. "Jaden, that's not true. You're an awesome person. If they can't see that, then it's their loss." Jaden appreciated her words, but they felt hollow, as if they couldn't quite reach the part of him that was hurting. He wanted to believe her, wanted to believe that the problem wasn't with him, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he was somehow to blame. The three of them sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the park, and a chill settled over them as the warmth of the day faded. Eventually, Jaden stood up, forcing a smile as he looked at his friends. "Thanks for hanging out with me today," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil beneath the surface. "I think I'm gonna head home." Emily and Zach exchanged a worried glance, but they nodded, understanding that he needed some time alone. "If you need anything, just let us know," Zach said, his tone earnest. "We're here for you." Jaden nodded, appreciating their support, even if it couldn't ease the pain he felt. He walked home in silence, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. He had come to this neighborhood hoping for acceptance, for friendship and belonging, but all he had found was a wall of cold indifference and silent judgment. As he stepped into his house, he was greeted by the warm glow of the living room lights, the familiar smell of his mother's cooking wafting through the air. His parents were seated at the kitchen table, chatting and laughing as they prepared dinner, and for a moment, the sight of them eased the ache in his chest. "Hey, sweetheart," his mom called, looking up with a smile. "How was your day?" Jaden hesitated, forcing a smile as he set his bag down on the table. "It was fine," he said, his voice light, hiding the turmoil within him. He didn't want to worry his parents, didn't want to burden them with his pain when they had worked so hard to give him a better life. But as he sat down at the table, his mother's eyes softened, and she reached out to place a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Jaden, you know you can tell us anything, right?" The warmth in her voice, the understanding in her eyes, nearly broke him. He wanted to tell her everything, to pour out the hurt and frustration he had been carrying, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He didn't want her to see him as weak, as someone who couldn't handle the challenges of their new life. "Yeah," he said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "I know." That night, as he lay in bed, Jaden stared at the ceiling, the events of the day playing over and over in his mind. He thought about the doors that had been closed in his face, the cold glances and hesitant smiles, and the way people seemed to hold back, as if he were somehow different, somehow less. The ache in his chest was a constant reminder of the loneliness he felt, of the wall that separated him from the people around him. He had tried to ignore it, to believe that things would get better, but the truth was becoming harder to deny. For the first time since they had moved, Jaden began to wonder if he would ever truly belong, if he would ever feel like he was part of this place. And as he drifted off to sleep, a single thought lingered in his mind, filling him with a sadness he couldn't shake. Maybe this place would never be home. Jaden woke up the next morning with a lingering heaviness in his chest. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the previous day in his mind. The looks, the closed doors, the silent judgments, they weighed on him, filling him with a sense of isolation he couldn't shake. He had tried so hard to ignore it, to brush it off as a misunderstanding or a coincidence, but the truth was becoming undeniable. He wasn't welcome here, at least not by everyone, and he couldn't help but wonder why. As he got ready for school, he found himself moving slower than usual, his energy drained by the weight of his thoughts. His parents had noticed a change in him, the quietness that had settled over him, but he had done his best to reassure them, forcing a smile and telling them everything was fine. He didn't want them to worry, didn't want them to see how much he was struggling to fit in, but even as he tried to push the thoughts aside, they lingered, a constant reminder of the distance between him and the people around him. He had come to this neighborhood hoping for a fresh start, a chance to make new friends and build a life filled with happiness and acceptance. But all he had found were walls he couldn't see, but that he felt every time he stepped out of his house. A few days later, Emily and Zach invited him to come along for another round of trick-or-treating. They were insistent, trying to lift his spirits, and Jaden found himself reluctantly agreeing, though he couldn't shake the feeling of dread that settled over him as they made their way through the neighborhood. They visited a few houses, collecting candy and laughing as they moved from door to door. For a while, Jaden managed to lose himself in the moment, letting go of the tension that had gripped him for so long. The warmth of his friends' laughter, the soft glow of the Halloween decorations, the rustle of leaves underfoot. It was enough to make him forget, if only for a little while. But as they approached a familiar house, Jaden's heart sank. It was the house of Mrs. Turner, the woman who had first refused to give him candy on Halloween. The memory of her cold stare, the way she had looked at him with disdain, came rushing back, filling him with a mix of anger and hurt. He wanted to turn around, to avoid another confrontation, but his friends were already making their way up the steps, laughing and chatting as if nothing was wrong. Jaden hesitated, his feet rooted to the spot as he watched them knock on the door. He knew he should follow them, should act like everything was fine, but he couldn't bring himself to move. The thought of facing Mrs. Turner again, of seeing that look in her eyes, made his chest tighten with a feeling he couldn't explain. Emily turned back, noticing his hesitation, and gave him an encouraging smile. "Come on, Jaden. It's just one house. Maybe she'll be nicer this time." Jaden forced a smile, nodding as he took a deep breath and joined them on the doorstep. He tried to keep his expression neutral, to hide the tension that had settled over him, but his hands were clenched tightly around his candy bag, his knuckles white with the effort of holding back his emotions. After a few moments, the door opened, and Mrs. Turner appeared, her expression hardening as her gaze landed on Jaden. She didn't say anything at first, simply staring at him with a look of disdain that made his stomach twist. He felt exposed, vulnerable under her gaze, as if he were a stranger in his own skin. Zach, sensing the tension, tried to break the silence, holding out his candy bag with a friendly smile. "Hi, Mrs. Turner. We're just out getting some leftover candy." Mrs. Turner's gaze flickered to Zach and Emily, her expression softening slightly as she gave them a curt nod. But when her eyes returned to Jaden, her face twisted into a sneer and she crossed her arms over her chest, blocking the doorway as if to prevent him from entering. "I don't have anything for you," she said, her voice cold and dismissive. She gestured to Jaden with a wave of her hand, her eyes narrowing as she looked him over. "You've already taken enough." Jaden's heart sank, a mix of humiliation and anger welling up inside him. He wanted to say something, to defend himself, but the words were trapped in his throat, caught beneath the weight of her disdain. He could feel his friends watching him, their expressions a mix of confusion and discomfort, but he couldn't bring himself to look at them, couldn't bear the thought of them seeing him like this. Mrs. Turner's eyes narrowed as she took a step closer, her gaze filled with a contempt that made his skin crawl. "Go on, get out of here," she snapped, her voice laced with bitterness. "And don't come back." Without warning, she reached out and gave him a light slap on the shoulder, as if to physically push him away. The touch was brief, barely more than a brush of her fingers, but it carried a weight that Jaden felt deep within his chest. It was as if she had poured all her hatred, all her unspoken judgments into that one gesture. Jaden stood frozen, his body rigid as he processed what had just happened. He could feel the sting of her hand on his shoulder, the echo of her words reverberating in his mind. His heart pounded, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and shame, but he couldn't bring himself to move, couldn't bring himself to speak. Emily and Zach stood in stunned silence, their faces pale with disbelief. They had expected Mrs. Turner to be unfriendly, maybe even rude, but this was something else entirely. The air between them felt heavy, thick with tension as they struggled to make sense of what had just happened. Finally, Jaden turned and walked away, his head lowered as he fought back the tears that threatened to spill over. He could hear his friends following him, their footsteps hesitant, as if they didn't know how to approach him, didn't know what to say. The walk back home was filled with an oppressive silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. Jaden's mind was racing, replaying the encounter over and over, the sting of Mrs. Turner's hand, the coldness in her eyes, the way she had dismissed him as if he were nothing. When they reached the edge of the park, Jaden finally spoke, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Thanks for coming with me," he said, his tone hollow. "But I think I'm done for tonight." Emily and Zach exchanged a glance, their expressions filled with sympathy and guilt. They could see the hurt in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped with a weight they couldn't fully understand. They wanted to say something, to offer words of comfort, but they knew that nothing they said would make the pain go away. "Hey, we're here for you," Emily said softly, reaching out to give his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "If you need anything, just let us know, okay?" Jaden managed a small nod, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, thanks." As he watched his friends walk away, Jaden felt a surge of loneliness wash over him, a sense of isolation that he had never experienced before. He had always thought that moving to this neighborhood would mean new friends, new opportunities, a chance to build a life filled with happiness and acceptance. But now, he wasn't so sure. The events of Halloween and the encounter with Mrs. Turner had left him questioning everything he thought he knew about this place, about the people who lived here, and about himself. That night, as he lay in bed, Jaden stared at the ceiling, replaying the encounter with Mrs. Turner in his mind. He wondered if he had done something to deserve it, if there was something wrong with him that made people treat him this way. The more he thought about it, the more the doubt began to eat away at him, filling him with a hollow ache that wouldn't go away. The sting of her touch lingered, a reminder of the rejection he had felt, the way she had dismissed him as if he were nothing. He had come to this neighborhood hoping for a new beginning, a place where he could belong, but all he had found was a wall of indifference and silent judgment. For the first time, Jaden began to wonder if he would ever truly belong here, if he would ever feel like he was part of this place. And as he drifted off to sleep, a single question lingered in his mind, filling him with a sadness he couldn't shake. Why? Jaden didn't know how he got through the following days. The encounter with Mrs. Turner had left him shaken, hollow, and questioning everything. He moved through his routine in a haze, trying to ignore the knot of emotions lodged deep in his chest. His parents could sense that something was wrong, but Jaden found himself unable to share what had happened. How could he explain the mixture of shame, confusion, and helplessness he felt? How could he tell them that, despite their dreams of a new beginning, he felt like an outsider in his own neighborhood? One morning, a few days after the incident, Jaden woke to find his phone buzzing incessantly. He rubbed his eyes, still half asleep, and reached for it. Notifications flooded his screen. Texts, social media alerts, and missed calls from Emily and Zach. His heart skipped a beat as he opened the first message from Zach. "Dude, have you seen the video?" "Video?" Jaden's heart raced as he scrolled through his messages, piecing together fragments of hurried texts. Emily and Zach had managed to capture part of Mrs. Turner's confrontation with him on camera. They hadn't meant to record her, but Zach had started filming their trick-or-treat outing, hoping to get a few fun moments for their social media feed. He hadn't realized he'd recorded Mrs. Turner's actions until he reviewed the footage later that night. The video had made its way online, and within hours it had spread throughout the neighborhood and beyond. People were talking about it, sharing it, commenting on the blatant hostility Mrs. Turner had shown. The video had sparked outrage, drawing attention to an issue that had remained hidden behind closed doors for too long. Jaden stared at his phone, his hands trembling as he read through the comments. Some people expressed shock and sympathy, condemning Mrs. Turner's actions and supporting him. Others were less sympathetic, questioning his motives, suggesting he had somehow provoked her, or dismissing the incident as a misunderstanding. The mixed reactions only deepened the knot in Jaden's stomach, making him feel as though he were standing on shaky ground. His parents were the next to find out. His mother, her face etched with worry, sat him down at the kitchen table, her hands resting gently on his shoulders. "Jaden, we saw the video. Do you want to talk about it?" Jaden's throat tightened as he met her gaze, the concern in her eyes almost too much to bear. He had been holding everything in for so long, trying to be strong, trying to protect them from the pain he felt. But now, with the truth out in the open, he couldn't hold back any longer. "It's been like this since we moved here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "People look at me like I don't belong. They smile, but it's not real. And then Mrs. Turner, she made it clear that I'm not welcome here." His mother's eyes filled with tears as she listened, her expression a mix of sorrow and anger. "Jaden, I am so sorry," she whispered, pulling him into a tight hug. "I wish I could protect you from this. I wish we could make them see you for who you really are." Jaden's father joined them, his face grim as he placed a comforting hand on Jaden's shoulder. "You did nothing wrong, Jaden. None of this is your fault. Sometimes people are afraid of what they don't understand, and they lash out in ways that are unfair and wrong." Jaden nodded, but a part of him still felt hollow, as though the weight of the neighborhood's judgment had left a permanent mark. His parents' words were comforting, but they couldn't erase the hurt, the sense of rejection that had settled deep within him. The video continued to spread, drawing attention from people outside the neighborhood. Reporters began contacting Jaden's family, eager to learn more about the story behind the video. His parents did their best to protect him from the media frenzy, but there was no escaping the whispers and stares whenever they stepped outside. The neighborhood itself was split down the middle. Some neighbors expressed support, reaching out to Jaden's family with apologies and offers of help. They condemned Mrs. Turner's actions, insisting that she didn't represent the values of the community. Others, however, defended her, claiming that the video didn't tell the whole story, that Jaden was overreacting, or that his family was seeking attention. One afternoon, as Jaden was coming home from school, he noticed a group of neighbors gathered on a nearby lawn, their voices raised in a heated argument. He recognized a few of them, parents of his classmates, people he had seen at community events, faces that had once smiled politely but now seemed hardened, closed off. "People make mistakes," one woman said, her voice strained with frustration. "We don't need outsiders stirring up trouble over one incident." "Outsiders?" another voice retorted, filled with indignation. "This is about standing up for what's right. That boy was mistreated, and we can't just ignore it." Jaden felt his cheeks flush as he realized they were talking about him. He quickened his pace, keeping his head down as he walked past them, hoping they wouldn't notice him. The last thing he wanted was to be at the center of a neighborhood feud, a symbol of division and resentment. As he reached his front door, he heard a voice call his name. He turned to see one of his neighbors, Mrs. Patel, approaching him with a gentle smile. She was an older woman, always kind and warm, one of the few people who had welcomed his family with open arms when they first moved in. "Jaden," she said softly, her eyes filled with sympathy, "I just want you to know that there are people here who care about you, who see you for who you are." Jaden managed a small smile, appreciating her words even if they couldn't erase the pain he felt. "Thank you, Mrs. Patel." She reached out, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Don't let them make you feel small, Jaden. You have every right to be here, just like anyone else." Her words stayed with him as he entered the house, filling him with a sense of warmth and validation he hadn't felt in a long time. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there were people who saw him, who understood the struggle he was facing. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood continued to grow. Some neighbors organized a small gathering in support of Jaden, holding signs with messages of kindness and acceptance, while others muttered disapprovingly from their porches, their faces tight with resentment. The once quiet, orderly streets had become a battleground, a place where people took sides and voices rose in anger and frustration. Jaden felt caught in the middle, torn between the desire to stand up for himself and the fear of making things worse. He hadn't asked for this attention, hadn't wanted to be the center of a conflict that was tearing his neighborhood apart. All he had wanted was a chance to belong, to find friends, to be a part of something bigger than himself. One evening, as he sat at the dinner table with his parents, his father spoke, his voice calm but firm. "Jaden, we know this has been difficult for you, and we're so proud of the strength you've shown, but you have a choice to make. You can let their words and actions define you, or you can show them who you really are." Jaden looked up, meeting his father's steady gaze. He knew what his father was saying, that he had the power to shape his own story, to rise above the hurt and the hatred, to prove that he was more than the labels they tried to place on him. It wouldn't be easy. The scars left by Mrs. Turner's rejection, by the judgment of his neighbors, would take time to heal. But Jaden knew that he couldn't let them win, couldn't let their prejudice take away his sense of self, his pride in who he was. The following week, Jaden returned to school, his head held high. He still felt the weight of the stares, the whispers that followed him wherever he went, but he refused to let them break him. He focused on his studies, on his friendships with Emily and Zach, on the things that brought him joy and meaning. And slowly, he began to see a change. Some of his classmates, moved by the video and the strength he had shown, reached out to him, offering words of support and encouragement. They apologized for the way they had treated him, for the distance they had kept, and he found himself forgiving them, understanding that they too were learning, growing, trying to become better. His friendship with Emily and Zach grew stronger, the bond between them deepening as they stood by him through the turmoil. They had seen the hurt he had endured, had witnessed the struggle he faced, and they had chosen to stand by him, to defend him, to be the friends he needed. That night, as he lay in bed, Jaden felt a sense of peace settle over him. The pain was still there, the scars left by the events of the past weeks, but he no longer felt alone. He had found allies, people who saw him for who he was, who valued him, who believed in him. And as he drifted off to sleep, he realized that he was stronger than he had ever known. He had faced rejection, hatred, and judgment, but he had come through it with his head held high, with a sense of self that no one could take from him. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, this place could become a home. The days stretched into weeks, and gradually, life in the neighborhood began to settle. The initial uproar over the video had subsided, leaving behind a mixture of lingering tension and quiet acceptance. Some neighbors had begun to warm to Jaden and his family, offering hesitant smiles and small gestures of friendliness. Others, however, kept their distance, their gazes still clouded with suspicion or discomfort. But Jaden had learned not to let their opinions define him. He had grown stronger, more self-assured, and he carried himself with a quiet pride that couldn't be shaken. As autumn slipped into winter, Jaden found himself settling into his routine, focusing on his schoolwork, his friends, and the things that brought him joy. Emily and Zach remained his closest allies, their friendship deepening as they continued to stand by him, sharing laughter and support that eased the ache of his earlier experiences. Together, they had faced the neighborhood's scrutiny, and they had emerged from it with a bond that felt unbreakable. One chilly afternoon, Jaden was walking home from school, his breath visible in the frosty air as he pulled his scarf tighter around his neck. He noticed the familiar houses lining the street, each one draped in winter decorations, twinkling lights, wreaths on doors, the occasional snowman peeking out from the front yard. For the first time, he felt a sense of warmth as he looked around, a quiet appreciation for the neighborhood he had once viewed with suspicion and hurt. As he approached his house, he saw Mrs. Turner's home just a few doors down, her yard neatly maintained, her front porch adorned with holiday decorations. He hadn't spoken to her since the incident on Halloween, hadn't even looked in her direction if he could help it. But now, as he stood there, something inside him urged him to confront the past, to face the pain and fear that her actions had left behind. Taking a deep breath, Jaden walked slowly toward her house, his footsteps crunching softly against the icy sidewalk. He felt a mixture of nerves and resolve, a strange determination that propelled him forward, even as part of him wanted to turn back. When he reached her doorstep, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorbell. He wondered if she would open the door, if she would even remember him. But he knew that he needed to do this, for himself, for his own peace of mind. He pressed the doorbell, hearing the faint chime echo through the house. Moments later, the door creaked open, and Mrs. Turner appeared, her expression shifting from surprise to discomfort as she recognized him. She said nothing, simply looking at him with a guarded expression, her hands folded in front of her. "Hi, Mrs. Turner," Jaden said, his voice steady despite the tension that hung between them. "I just wanted to say, I don't hold anything against you." She stared at him, her eyes widening slightly, as if she hadn't expected him to say those words. He could see the flicker of something, maybe regret, maybe shame, cross her face, but it was gone just as quickly, replaced by her usual guarded demeanor. "I didn't come here to ask for an apology," Jaden continued, choosing his words carefully. "I just wanted you to know that I'm not angry. I'm not going to let what happened keep me from being myself, from being proud of who I am." Mrs. Turner's expression softened, if only for a moment. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then closed it, the words seemingly caught in her throat. Jaden could see the struggle in her eyes, the unspoken conflict that lingered beneath the surface. But he knew that whatever she might have said, or not said, didn't matter. He had found his own peace, his own strength, and he didn't need her approval or understanding to feel whole. "Goodbye, Mrs. Turner," he said quietly, offering her a small nod before turning and walking away. As he made his way back down the sidewalk, he felt a sense of relief wash over him, as though he had finally closed a chapter that had been weighing on his heart for too long. As the weeks passed, Jaden continued to grow more comfortable in the neighborhood, finding joy in the small moments, the laughter he shared with Emily and Zach, the quiet evenings spent with his parents, the warmth of his home during the cold winter nights. He no longer felt the need to prove himself, to seek validation from people who didn't see his worth. He had found strength in himself, in his family, and in the friends who had stood by him through everything. One evening, his family decided to host a small gathering, inviting a few neighbors who had shown kindness and support in recent months. The house was filled with laughter and conversation, the scent of his mother's cooking wafting through the air, mingling with the sound of friendly voices. Jaden watched as his parents chatted with their guests, their faces alight with happiness, and he felt a surge of gratitude for the life they had built together. As the night drew to a close, Mrs. Patel, the warm and caring neighbor who had supported him from the beginning, pulled him aside. She looked at him with a smile, her eyes shining with pride. "You know, Jaden," she said, her voice gentle, "you've shown everyone here what it means to be strong. You've inspired people, changed minds, and no one can take that away from you." Jaden felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to her words, the quiet validation filling him with a sense of fulfillment he hadn't expected. He realized in that moment that he had found something greater than acceptance. He had found a purpose, a reason to keep moving forward, to stand tall in the face of adversity. "Thank you, Mrs. Patel," he replied, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." She nodded, reaching out to give his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You're going to do amazing things, Jaden. I have no doubt about that." As he watched her walk away, Jaden felt a surge of determination, a quiet resolve that filled him with a sense of purpose. He knew that his journey was far from over, that there would be challenges and hardships along the way, but he was ready, and he knew that he had the strength to face whatever came next. That night, as he lay in bed, Jaden stared up at the ceiling, a peaceful smile tugging at his lips. He thought about the past few months, about the pain and the struggle, about the friendships he had forged and the lessons he had learned. He realized that he had found something even more important than acceptance. He had found a sense of belonging that came from within, a quiet confidence that couldn't be shaken by the opinions of others. He knew that he would still face challenges, that there would still be people who judged him, who saw him as different. But he also knew that he was more than their judgments, more than the hurtful words and actions that had once defined him. He was Jaden, a boy with dreams, with a family who loved him, with friends who stood by him. And that was enough. As he drifted off to sleep, he felt a sense of peace settle over him, a warmth that filled him from within. He had crossed a new threshold, stepping into a future filled with hope, strength, and a quiet resolve that would carry him forward. For the first time since they had moved, he felt truly at home. Thank you for watching to the end. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new stories, and don't forget to check out the other videos. More interesting stories are waiting for you there. Stay tuned, there's a lot more exciting stuff to come.